All right, let's dive into the saga of one of history's most terrifying and fascinating Viking leaders, Ivar the Boneless. But I want you to forget the one-dimensional brute you think you know. We're going to look at him through a completely different and honestly much more interesting lens. Okay, just let this sink in for a second. This quote right here captures the whole mystery of Ivar. I mean, how does a man with a nickname that suggests he's frail or weak become one of the most feared commanders of the entire Viking age? It just doesn't add up, right? And that puzzle leads us to the core question of this whole explainer. Let's push aside what you've seen in TV shows. We're going to explore a really radical idea. What if Ivar's infamous cruelty wasn't just about bloodlust? What if it was a profound, almost philosophical, and incredibly violent quest for meaning?
So, first up, the boneless paradox. To even begin to understand the man, we have to tackle the name. What does it actually mean to be boneless?
You know, historians have been arguing about this for centuries. First, there's the literal take. Maybe he had a physical condition, something like brittle bone disease. Then you've got the metaphorical angle, that boneless was a nod to his snake-like cunning and flexibility in battle. And of course, there's the chance it's just a mistranslation, with some thinking his name really meant the hated. The honest truth? We just don't know for sure. But here's what's really interesting to think about. Whatever the reason for the name, if Ivar couldn't rely on being the biggest, strongest warrior on the battlefield, he'd be forced to become the smartest. His mind had to become his greatest weapon, forging this incredible strategic genius that his more physically powerful brothers, might never have needed to develop. Okay, section 2. Myth versus man. Now let's start peeling back the layers because it is absolutely crucial to separate the legend we see in pop culture from the fragmented history we actually have to work with. Can you even imagine the pressure? Your dad is Ragnar Lothbrok, basically a rock star of the Viking world, a figure of pure legend. Every one of his sons is expected to be a titan. So for Ivar, living in that massive shadow, especially with a name like the Boneless, well, that must have created this enormous drive to prove himself in other, much more terrifying ways. And this right here, this just sums it up perfectly. On one side, you have the legend, the pop culture icon, the bloodthirsty, screaming berserker. But when you actually dig into the historical sources, you find the enigma, a brilliant strategist, a man maybe defined by a mysterious physical condition, and a history that's just so much more complicated than some simple, brutal caricature. So, Section 3, the Scourge of England. How did this mysterious figure make his mark on the world? Well, he unleashed an absolute storm on England. As one of the leaders of the so-called Great Heathen Army, and trust me, this was a massive coalition of Norse warriors, Ivar's impact was cataclysmic. His tactics were brilliant, his campaigns were ruthlessly efficient, and he basically just carved a path of destruction across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that changed the course of English history forever.
But this is where it gets so fascinating. You have to ask about the motive. Was this just a pragmatic Viking commander doing what it takes to conquer and win? Or was there something else going on here? A kind of nihilism almost. A complete disregard for life and order that went way beyond simple conquest.
Which brings us to Section 4, an existential Viking? That question leads us straight to the wild idea at the heart of this entire explainer. What if we look at Ivar not just as a warrior, but as a kind of philosopher? Okay, quick crash course. At its core, existentialism is the idea that we're all just kind of thrown into a universe that doesn't have any built-in meaning or purpose. There's no instruction manual. It's up to each and every one of us to create our own values and define who we are through our choices and our actions. So, here's the kicker. How does that philosophy apply to Ivar? A man who, maybe because of his physical reality, was denied the traditional Viking path to glory, being the strongest, toughest warrior. What do you do when the world's pre-written script for your life just doesn't fit? Well, you forge your own path. If the world denies you power through strength, you reject that world's values entirely. You decide that your own actions, your own will, are going to be the source of your meaning. Your purpose isn't something you're given, it's something you seize, something you impose on the world around you. And when you look at it through that lens, Ivar's extreme brutality is totally transformed. It's no longer just random violence. It becomes a tool, a terrifyingly effective way for him to assert his own existence. In every battle won, in every city burned, he is screaming to the world that he is here, that his will matters, and that he is the one defining the terms of his own reality. So, let's wrap this up. Section 5, Ivar's lasting echo. What is the legacy of this existential Viking? I mean, his historical impact is just undeniable. The Great Heathen Army didn't just win a few fights, it fundamentally changed England's landscape. It established what was known as the Danelaw, a huge area of Norse rule that literally reshaped the map. His strategic brilliance is just a fact.
But beyond the battlefield, his story, it forces us to confront a much deeper and maybe a much more uncomfortable truth about where we human beings find our purpose.
And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? Ivar the Boneless becomes this kind of dark archetype, a man who, faced with a world that might have written him off as worthless, decided instead to burn that world down and build his own meaning from the ashes. Which leaves us with this final, kind of chilling question. Ivar's answer was conquest and terror, but his story really forces all of us to ask ourselves, in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, how do we find our own purpose, and what are we willing to do to achieve it?